All right. I'll try to stay over here because I know that makes for a better video, but it's very difficult for me.
You do what you got.
Yeah, it's hard to stay in one place sometimes. We're continuing our study here on geography and history, and we're kind of smack dab in the middle of Genesis. And I know Rick's teaching a class on Genesis here. I think Cain and Abel is the last one you've done?
Yeah, I'm doing a slow series early on.
Yeah, so we're just blowing like the wind right through it. Rick's actually probably doing a way better job at teaching this than I am, but we're just kind of doing an overview of this. Last time we talked about Abraham. And he was called out of a certain city, had made it 2 letters. What city did Abraham come from? Ur. Yeah, that's what a bear says. Right? So Abraham comes out of Ur, and he goes to the promised land, and he takes some people with him. He takes his father with him. His name's Terah. And then he takes his nephew with him, and his name is Lot, right? So they travel in through the promised land. God makes these promises to Abraham, these 5 promises. No, the 3 promises, right, he makes. Just see if you're paying attention here. The first promise is what?
A son, right?
Nope.
Seed, land.
Yep, they're going to be a great nation, right? And then they're going to have a place to live, some land. And then the last promise is in his seed, the world was going to be blessed. So those are the 3 promises God makes to Abraham. As we study the Bible, if we've studied it for any amount of time, we understand that the nation promise was fulfilled in the Exodus, right? Because they had become a great nation. And we know that the land promise was fulfilled in Joshua, because that's when they have the conquest of Canaan after they wandered in the wilderness for a while. And the seed promise was not fulfilled all the way until Jesus, because that was the vehicle that allowed all of the world to be blessed. Jesus was the one that came to this earth and died for the sins of mankind so that we could be brought back into God's family, so to speak. So those are all the things we talked about kind of with Abraham. And at the end of Abraham's life, he needs to get a son or a wife for his son Isaac. So he sends Isaac's servant back to Haran, where they were from, and he secures a wife for him, and her name is Rebecca. And they get married and they have some children. And all time goes past, and Abraham eventually dies. And Isaac, if you look here, let me see if I can do this. Oh, right here, you see that little red dot there that was there? That is where Isaac is hanging out. He's over at that area. And eventually, and it's called Beer Lahoi Roy. And if you see the name Beer, what do you know about that place? A bunch of drunks there?
Isn't that a fountain?
There's a fountain or a well. There's water there. That's what that means. So he's this place, Beer Lahoi Roy, and a famine comes over the land, and God says, you can't go back down to Egypt, because there was famines didn't really happen that often in Egypt, except for the ones we read about, in the time of Joseph later on here. But the Egyptian area was the Nile would flood pretty reliably, and they pretty reliably had food because of that. So when times got bad, a lot of people would go to Egypt. But God told Isaac, he says, you can't go there. So he goes over to Gerar, and that's in the area where the Philistines are at. And Isaac is real successful over in that area. So you can kind of see that right there. You see that place there? That's where he goes to. And he does some farming, and he's very successful at it, and he makes all kinds of money. And do you think the people around him were real happy about that? No, they weren't, because that's the way it usually works. People, when one person is successful and maybe everybody else isn't successful, there's jealousy involved, and we see that a lot of times in the Bible. So that's what happens. Is he's there, and he kind of gets some people upset at him because he's successful, and he just kind of quietly leaves to this place called Beersheba. And what do you think is in Beersheba? A well, that's right, because we see that word again. Now that well was a well that Abraham had dug, but what would happen is a lot of times Abraham would dig these wells and he may move on, and people would come in and fill those wells in. Why do you think they would do that?
Keep people out.
Keep people out, that's right. Makes it easier to control the place if you can keep people out of there. So he goes back there and he digs that well out again, and he settles there. And Isaac and his wife Rebekah have twin sons. What are their names?
Esau.
Jacob and Esau, that's right. Which one's older? Esau's the older one, right? So he has these two sons, and one son is kind of better than the other son, but neither of them are perfect, right? So in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 16 there that I have on the screen, it notes that Esau was godless and sexually immoral, right? So that's a little bit of later scripture that gives some more insight into the character of Esau. We wouldn't get that necessarily just from maybe we could assume some of those things, but this is an inspired description of the character of Esau. He's not a godly man, right? And because of this, he's kind of a distress on his parents. His parents aren't really comfortable with that, and as being a parent, I could understand that, right? That would be something that would bug you. And he had a birthright. Back then, the oldest son had privileges that the other children wouldn't have. He would basically become the leader of the family after his father died, and of course he'd inherit everything. So that's a big deal. But he despised that, and he sold his birthright for a meal. Now let's talk. Since we're on that, let's talk about Jacob a little bit. Now. Jacob probably should have treated his brother better when he came to him when he was hungry, right? He probably shouldn't have kind of conned him out of his birthright for a bowl of soup. But nonetheless, that's what he did. And he probably shouldn't have deceived his father for his father's blessing. See, one of the other privileges of being the oldest son was that you would get this blessing from your father, and the blessing would include, prosperity and all the riches that you might inherit, and good fortune. All of those things were kind of wrapped up in that blessing. And Jacob deceived his father, and he received this blessing. And of course Esau was really upset about it, as you could imagine. He was so mad he wanted to kill his brother. So Jacob decided he needed to get out of town, right? And you can see there I have a red circle around Bethel. Now Bethel at this time, of course every map you see is going to have Bethel as Bethel, but it wasn't called that then. It was called Luz, L-U-Z. So that's where he goes to. He goes to this place which we now call Bethel, and this is where God appears to him. And he is climbing, and he sees angels doing what? Going up and down a ladder, right? One guy, I was in a Bible class one day, and it was Todd Moffat over at Thayer Street years ago, and he did a lesson on this, and his synopsis of the lesson was that the ladder was Jesus. It was the way that we could get from earth to heaven. That was what that was about. I thought that was a pretty interesting thing to think about. But he has this vision, and so that happens there at Bethel, and he leaves there, and he goes up to Haran, because that's where Rebekah's family is from. And when he gets there to Haran, let's see what this next slide is. Yeah, so he gets there to Haran, and he goes and he sees this young gal trying to water the flocks, and he helps her, and then he finds out that she's probably his second or third cousin, and it goes back with her to her family, and he falls in love with her, with Rachel. And he makes a deal with his uncle. He says, I'll work 7 years for Rachel. And he says, oh, that sounds real good. So he makes this deal and he works the 7 years. And I think it's interesting, just like Jacob deceived Isaac, his father-in-law deceives him and gives him Rachel's older sister, and her name is Leah, as a wife. So Jacob ends up working another 7 years for her as well. So he ends up with 2 wives there while he's there. And while he's there in that area, he does pretty well for himself. It seems like everything he does turns to gold. And he makes, after he's worked the 14 years for his 2 wives, he works another period of time to gain flocks. And he basically tells his father-in-law, I'll take all the funny colored ones, right? So he takes all these funny colored sheep and goats, and boy, they just do incredible. Remember, he has this breeding program where he puts them in front of this certain bush, and everything works out great. Probably not something we do today, but obviously that was something of God, the reason this was done. So he gets all of these, his worldly goods increase, and just like happens in life, his brother-in-laws are kind of jealous of him. So that's what this kind of says. He says, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all the wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Right? So a new leaf has been turned over. He says, then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. And so Jacob just does what God says. He does just that. And he leaves Haran, and he starts going back to where he came from. And he gets to this place. In the King James, it's called Gilead, Gileed. Later on, it's called Gilead. That's how we would probably think of it today. So he gets there, and that's where his father-in-law overtakes him. Now, there's probably some cause for concern, because he kind of went in the middle of the night, kind of snuck out of there. And also, Rachel had stolen some things, right? So, of course, I'm sure that Jacob didn't know that. But his father-in-law was pretty hot. But luckily, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, and he told him, he said, listen, he goes, say nothing good or bad to him. So he has a warning, so he's going to kind of keep his cool while he's having this meeting. And they come to an agreement. They put up a heap of stones there as a witness to the agreement that they have. And Jacob continues on. And it says that, okay, so that we already covered that. So then he comes to this area called Succoth. And this is where the Lord appears to him a second time. So this is where he hears that his brother's coming. And let me see here. I want to see what this slide says. Yeah, so he hears that Esau's coming out to meet him. And I would imagine he was upset about that, scared about that. Why would this be a concern to him?
Because he had his birthright.
Yeah, he had his birthright. The last time they were together, what did Esau want to do to him? To kill him, right? So now he hears his brothers coming out to him, and he's got a whole bunch of people with them. So he's going to be upset. So he sends the people ahead of him, and let me see here. Yeah, we'll stay on this slide. So he sends the people ahead of him, and he prays to God. And this is where Jacob wrestles with God. and he's given a new name. And what's the new name that he's given? Israel. So that's where he's renamed. So he meets up with his brother, and everything's fine. They get along good. They have a good little reunion there, and they end up going their separate ways. His brother goes back to a place called Seir, S-E-I-R, and Jacob can't go with him because he's got so many animals and livestock with him. He knows that if he pushes them too hard, they'll all die. So he tells his brother that, and they part ways. So he comes to this place called Shechem, and this is where his daughter Dinah is raped by one of the princes in this area. And the Bible identifies the prince, his name is Shechem as well. And of course, her brothers are not real happy about this. They're pretty upset. And they come up with this scheme. They go up there, so they go up there, and this young man wants her as his wife, and he says, well, if you guys all get circumcised like we are, you can have our sister as your wife. Well, the Bible says on the third day, when their pain was at its height, they went in there and just slaughtered them people. And of course, news of something like that is going to travel. So Jacob was not real happy with his sons for doing this, because now he kind of put them all in danger by doing that. So they leave that area, Shechem, and they go back to Bethel. And Bethel is that place where God first appears to Jacob. And and I didn't mention this, but this is, when God first met Jacob, he renewed that covenant that he had made with Abraham. So 3 different times that covenant's renewed. So you have it initially given to Jacob, and it's renewed to Isaac, and it's renewed again to Jacob. That's why we call them the patriarchs. Those 3 men, we call them the patriarchs. They're the fathers. That's kind of where that comes from. So they go to Bethel, and at Bethel, Rachel dies. She dies there in childbirth, and she has her second son, and his name is Benjamin. So that brings us all the way to Hebron, and he comes kind of going back to kind of where he started at. He goes back to Hebron there, and that brings us to the story of Joseph in this story. So Joseph is one of the sons, and it's interesting. You think about Jacob. He goes up to Haran, and the only thing he's got basically are the clothes on his back and a staff, and he leaves there. He leaves out of there with 11 sons and 4 wives and all these flocks. God blessed him. And he has all these children, and finally he has Benjamin there in Bethel. And as happens sometimes in families, maybe some of the brothers aren't as righteous as some of the other brothers, because after all, they're people. And it seems that Joseph is maybe a little bit more righteous than his brothers are. But I think one of the problems is Jacob recognizes that a little bit too much, right? So he sees that his son Joseph is a righteous young man. So he gives him this very special coat, this coat of many colors. I don't know anything about that, but whatever it was something that set him apart from all of his other siblings. It was a special thing. I think if somebody gave me a coat of many colors today, I'd be like, I don't think so. I'm not wearing that, right? But back then, this was a big deal. So what happens with Joseph is he starts having some dreams, and one of the dreams that he has is about some sheaves of wheat, and how there's one sheaf that's standing tall, and the rest of them were gathered around and bowed in front of his sheaf. And his brothers, who already probably don't like him because Dad's giving him special treatment, they're like, oh, I don't know about this. And then, of course, he has another dream, and he talks about the stars and how he says, I'll just read it here. He says, listen, brothers, he says, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. just so happens there's 11 brothers, right? So now they're kind of probably thinking some bad thoughts, especially a few of them. So what happened is his father wanted Joseph to go check on his brothers. So he goes out to check on them. I don't know if I have a map here. Maybe I have a map that shows that. Yeah, this one kind of shows it. So his father sends him to check on his brothers, and he can't find them. And then he meets some people, and they say, "Oh, they're up there by Dothan," and you can see that on this map here. And he travels up there, and when they see him, they say, "Oh, here comes the dreamer," and they start cooking up a plan to kill him. Luckily for Joseph, his brother Reuben was not on their side, right? So he had a plan to free Joseph the whole time. So Joseph comes up and they grab him and they throw him in a pit, and they kind of go far away from there to try to decide what they're going to do with him. I would admit, I've never been involved in abducting anybody, thankfully. But I would imagine if I was involved in something like that, you abducted somebody and then you're holding them somewhere. Now what do we do, right? We've done this crazy thing. Now what do we do? So they're all thinking, well, here's one idea. We're just going to kill him and tell Dad that some animal got him. And Reuben's like, oh, don't do that. And he comes up with this plan. Maybe they'll do something. They'll end up selling him or something like that. And they end up selling him to these Midianite traders. And they take him here. If you see that, let me see here. What's this next line? So, you see this solid red line here. I got to use the thing, right? This line here. You see, they take him away from Dothan and they take him all the way down to Egypt. Now, where did they take him in Egypt? Not 100% sure. Not 100% sure where that was at. But they take him down there. And he's sold into slavery. And he's sold into the slavery of this gentleman. His name was Potiphar. And he's got a wife. And we don't know a whole lot about what people in the Bible looked at. But one thing we can assume is that Joseph was probably a pretty good looking dude. Because Potiphar's wife just couldn't get enough of him. And she was always trying to seduce him. And he would not give in to her. So eventually, this happens, right? She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come then," and he ran. And she got kind of mad about that, right? And she made up a story that said, oh, he was trying to seduce her. So he got thrown in jail, which was not a good thing. And while he's in jail, as is the thing with Joseph, wherever he goes, he kind of makes the best of it. So he's in jail, and all of a sudden he becomes the head guy in the jail, the best prisoner there is. And while he's there, these two guys who were in service of the Pharaoh, they tell Joseph this story about these two dreams that they had. And one guy was the cupbearer. And the cupbearer was a pretty important position. In fact, there's two cupbearers we mention in the Bible. One of them's this cupbearer in this story with Joseph in prison. 10 points for somebody who could name the other cupbearer. Yes! Nehemiah, absolutely. Under the Persian king Artaxerxes, I believe. So Nehemiah was the other cupbearer. But being a cupbearer was an important thing because you had access to the king. That's a big deal. Right? So it was a very respected position. And this other guy's the baker. Of course, that's actually a respected position too, because he's preparing the king's food. He could poison the king if he wanted, right? But so these were trusted positions. They have these dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams. The end result is the cupbearer is restored, and the baker. What happens to him? He's executed, right? And the cupbearer says, "Oh, Joseph, I'll never forget this." And he immediately forgets it. Because that's what happens sometimes. Until several years later, and Pharaoh has a dream, and nobody can interpret it. And one of the things with the Egyptians is, they were into interpreting dreams. In fact, the Egyptians, they would have books. So, I have a dream. Oh yeah, I dreamed that, the cat was chasing the dog. And they'd get in the book and they'd look up, oh, here it is. Oh, here's the interpretation of it. It's in the book. Well, what had happened was Pharaoh has this crazy dream and they can't interpret it. Nobody can interpret the dream. Nobody's ever had a dream like this before. And the cupbearer says, oh, I remember this guy back in jail. And he could interpret dreams. So they brought Joseph out and he interprets the dreams. And the Pharaoh says, well, what do you think we ought to do? And he says, well, you should find somebody who really is smart and set him over everything and put everything in order. And the Pharaoh goes, oh, that sounds like you. So Joseph becomes second in charge only to Pharaoh. And so what Joseph does is he builds grain silos. And this is interesting. This is one of what many people believe is one of those grain silos. In Egypt, there were tons of these things. These huge, just monstrous grain silos. And most people, myself included, believe these were the silos that Joseph built to store grain. They weren't all in just one city. There were several cities that had these. So for 7 years they had a lot of good harvests, and they took all the grain and they stored them in these silos. And then the 7 years of famine came, and lo and behold, his brothers are in a bad spot because they don't have any food. Remember we talked earlier, when there was a famine, people would go to Egypt usually because they usually had food down there. They weren't relying on rainfall, right? The rain, it didn't rain in Egypt. What happened was the Nile flooded every spring, and they took all that water. They had canals dug everywhere, and they would have water storage ponds, and that's how they would grow crops there. So it was the original breadbasket of the world. So famine comes, go to Egypt, they probably got some food. People probably didn't realize that there was a famine in Egypt too, but luckily Joseph has stored up all of this grain. So his brothers go down there. We all know this story. They go down there, they purchase some grain. Joseph gives them kind of a hard time. He grills them, and he ends up getting them to bring his brother Benjamin down to them. So here's another map here. Kind of shows. So where are we at? So Joseph taking away number 4. So eventually, what happens is Joseph makes up with his brothers, and they're brought to this area called Goshen, which is like an area at that time where there were pasture lands. And since his brothers were sheep herders, they went over there and they took care of not only their sheep, but they took care of the Pharaoh's herds as well. So they had a job. And when all of this happens, he's able to bring his father there, and his father passes away. One of the interesting things is there's a pretty vivid description of how mummies were made in the last couple chapters of Genesis, if you're ever interested in that. It was it kind of details how they embalmed not only Jacob but Joseph as well. But they take they take Jacob back and they bury him at the Oaks of Mamre. Who else was buried there? Isaac and Abraham and Sarah. Yep, they were all buried over there. And I believe Leah. I don't know if Leah was buried there or not. I don't recall that. And that's the end of our story about Isaac, right? And his sons. And as we go through these things, you can't help but see God's hand in every aspect of Isaac's life, and especially as we study through all of these Old Testament stories, you see that these things weren't accidents. right? There was a plan involved. I think it's interesting, you know, when God makes a promise, he always keeps that promise. You think about later on when they're carried off to Babylon in captivity. Now, God had made a rule to the Israelites that every 7 years their land was supposed to not, they're not supposed to grow anything on it for in the 7th year. Well, sometime around the Judges, they just quit doing that. Right? And the reason that they were in captivity for 70 years was because God said, this is how many, it had been 490 years since they'd last done that. God said, this is how many years you were supposed to let the land rest. And the land is going to have its 7th year rest, but they're going to be all in a row. And that's the reason they were in captivity for 70 years. Because God said the land's going to have a rest. The reason I just say that is because when God makes a promise, when God makes a statute, when God makes a rule, it's going to be kept every single time. And for us today, we talk about that seed promise when we want to become a Christian. God said that through multiple prophecies in the Old Testament that he was going to send his son, right? And his son was going to establish a new kingdom. And that kingdom is the church, right? And to be a member of that church, you have to be baptized into its king, Jesus. And when you're baptized, your sins are forgiven. So if there's anyone this evening who has not been baptized, I'd urge you to do that. If you've got some other sin in your life, something you're struggling with, make that right with God. If you need help with something, we would love to help you. If anybody has a need, we ask them to come forward while we stand and while we sing.